My son was in the hospital. She said she couldn't take him. Money was tight. Then I saw what she was really doing. Something didn't add up. Why the sudden excuse? He decided to pay closer attention. The phone rang just after midnight, the shrill sound slicing through the quiet darkness of your bedroom and jolting you awake instantly, your heart thudding hard against your ribs as you fumbled for it on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with an unknown number at first but then switching to the hospital's main line as you answered in a daze, your voice groggy and confused until the nurse on the other end spoke those dreaded words that turned your blood cold. "We need you to bring your son." And immediately, his temperature is critically high and he's unresponsive, and in a single breathless moment everything seemed to tilt off its axis as you shot out of bed, heart hammering, adrenaline surging through your veins as you rushed to your son's room where he lay pale and still under his blanket, his little body burning up with fever, and you scooped him up in your arms, his head heavy against your shoulder, calling out to your partner to get dressed as you stumbled through the dark house grabbing essentials, your mind racing with fear and questions but no answers. The drive to the hospital felt endless, every red light and turn feeling like torture as you held your son close whispering reassurances he couldn't even hear. And when you finally arrived the emergency staff took him swiftly away from your arms, wheeling him into the ICU where they began tests and monitors and IVs, your hands trembling as you signed forms and tried to answer questions while tears blurred your vision, and amidst the chaos you managed to send a quick group message to family saying Arjun's in the hospital. We ran in the ICU, hoping for some kind of support or comfort, needing to hear a familiar voice, but mostly just trying to focus on keeping your son alive and stable as the hours stretched on in a blur of beeping machines and hushed voices and your own crumbling composure. A few hours passed in a haze of exhaustion and fear as you sat by Arjun's bedside, his small hand fragile in yours, the monitors flashing numbers you didn't fully understand but prayed were stable, and just as the first rays of morning light filtered weakly through the hospital window your phone buzzed on the bedside table, the sound startling you out of your thoughts as you picked it up and saw a text from your mother, your son's grandmother, the message brief but heavy with implications. "I'm so sorry to hear about Arjun. I wish I could be there, but money's really tight right now. Flights, stay, I just can't manage it. Please tell him I love him." And you stared at the screen, your heart sinking as the words sank in, the excuse landing like a blow even though you tried to tell yourself she was probably just embarrassed or overwhelmed. Typing back a simple "I understand" with a shaking hand, your throat tight and your chest heavy with a disappointment you couldn't quite name, trying to rationalize her words, telling yourself she must really be struggling financially or maybe she was just afraid of hospitals. But deep down a small voice whispered that this wasn't like her, that she had always been there for family events no matter the cost, and you pushed the thought away, focusing instead on Arjun who was still sleeping fitfully, his face pale and his breathing monitored by machines, your own eyes burning with exhaustion but unable to rest, your mind circling the strange message and the strange timing of it, wondering why she couldn't make even a small effort or offer to help in some other way, but you said nothing, just sat there holding your son's hand and whispering to him that everything was going to be okay, even as doubt and hurt quietly settled into your chest like a stone you couldn't yet name. The days blurred together in the sterile, fluorescent-lit world of the hospital where time seemed to stretch and compress all at once, each moment anchored by the steady beeping of the heart monitor beside Arjun's bed and the soft murmur of nurses moving quietly down the hallway, and you barely slept, stealing moments of rest in the hard plastic chair beside your son's bed, your body aching with exhaustion but your mind unable to surrender to unconsciousness for long, always jerking awake at the slightest sound or movement, and you lived minute by minute, hour by hour, speaking softly to Arjun even when he couldn't answer, brushing the hair from his forehead, holding his hand and telling him stories to keep him tethered to the world, your voice steady even as your heart cracked a little more with every passing day, and through it all you kept your composure, putting on a brave face for your child, for the nurses, for anyone who might be watching, but inside you were exhausted in every way, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and you found yourself wishing for just one familiar face, one person who could take even a small part of the burden from your shoulders. But when you thought of your mother's text and her excuse about money being tight, you pushed the thought away again, telling yourself she must have her reasons, that you couldn't afford to fall apart or to question her motives right now. Not when your son needed you to be strong, not when every decision felt like life or death, and so you kept going, putting one foot in front of the other, smiling through the pain, holding back the tears, and focusing only on Arjun's slow, fragile progress toward recovery, your world narrowing to the four walls of that hospital room where every breath he took was a victory and every moment of stillness a gift you didn't dare take for granted. In the quiet hours of the night when the hospital grew still and even the nurses seemed to move more softly, you found yourself alone with your thoughts, sitting by Arjun's bedside as he slept peacefully under the soft glow of the nightlight, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that had begun to feel like the only thing anchoring you to sanity, and in those moments of solitude the questions you had been pushing away began to creep back in, uninvited and persistent, swirling around your Mind like a storm you couldn't ignore, and you found your eyes drifting once again to your phone where your mother's text still lingered in your memory, the words money's tight echoing in your thoughts with a hollow ring that wouldn't fade. And you tried to tell yourself she was probably just embarrassed to admit she didn't want to come, or maybe she really was struggling financially, but the excuse felt thin, too convenient, and deep down you couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that the mother who had always been there for birthdays and school plays and minor scrapes and bruises hadn't they even tried to make it to the hospital for something as serious as this. And you thought about the times she had flown across the country for family weddings or taken spontaneous road trips just to visit relatives, and the contrast between those memories and her current excuse made your chest tighten with a confusing mix of hurt and confusion, but you said nothing, just watched your son sleep and tried to push the questions aside, telling yourself you were being unfair, that you didn't know what she was going through, that maybe she really couldn't afford it. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard you tried to focus on Arjun's slow recovery, it lingered there in the back of your mind, growing roots you weren't sure you wanted to examine too closely just yet. It was during one of those long, quiet nights when your best friend Ria came to visit, slipping quietly into the hospital room with a bag of snacks and a warm hug that nearly made you cry. And as she sat down beside you and glanced at Arjun sleeping peacefully, she asked the question you hadn't expected but had secretly been dreading, "Isn't they your mom coming at all?" And your heart clenched as you hesitated, then nodded and explained about the text, repeating your mother's words about money being tight and how she hadn't been able to manage the trip, and as you spoke you watched Ria's expression shift from concern to confusion, and then to something sharper, almost disbelieving, and before you could say anything else she leaned in and said quietly, "That's weird. I saw her story 2 days ago, she was at some family lunch, dressed up, posting photos, and your stomach dropped as if you'd been punched, the words hitting you harder than you expected because you hadn't checked her social media, hadn't wanted to see anything that might make you feel worse, but now those words brought everything rushing back, and you felt a wave of anger and hurt and disbelief wash over you, your mind spinning as you tried to reconcile the image of your mother laughing at a lunch with friends to the text she had sent you claiming she couldn't afford to visit her sick grandson in the hospital, and you didn't say anything to Ria, just nodded silently, your throat tight and your hands trembling as you looked back at Arjun, your mind racing with questions you didn't know how to answer, and as Ria stayed and talked to keep you company, you sat there quietly, the seed of suspicion now sprouting into something larger, something you couldn't ignore no matter how much you wanted to, and you realized that the story you had been telling yourself about your mom's excuse might not be the truth after all. Later that evening, when the hospital hallway had grown quiet and most visitors had gone home, you found yourself alone with your phone in your lap, your hands hovering uncertainly over the screen as you debated whether to look or not, your heart pounding in your chest with a mix of dread and curiosity, and finally, with a deep breath you scrolled to your mother's social media profile, your fingers trembling slightly as you navigated to her recent posts, and there it was, a story posted just 3 days ago, a bright, cheerful video of her sitting at a table in what looked like a local restaurant, surrounded by friends, smiling widely as she raised a glass in a toast. The caption reading something lighthearted about good company and good food, and your breath caught in your throat as you stared at the screen, the image clashing violently with the text she had sent you claiming she couldn't visit because money was tight, and you felt a surge of anger and betrayal rise up in you, but you forced yourself to stay calm, to breathe, to think, and you kept scrolling, finding more evidence, a post from an online store showing a package she had recently purchased, another story showing her at a mall, walking past shops with a friend, and you sat there in stunned silence, the phone growing heavier in your hands as the disconnect between her words and her actions became impossible to ignore, and for the first time you felt a crack forming in the image you had of your mother, the one who had always been selfless and caring, and you didn't know what to feel, hurt, confusion, anger, disbelief, all of it swirling together in a storm of emotions you couldn't yet process, and you put the phone down slowly, your mind racing, your heart heavy, and you stared at Arjun sleeping peacefully in the bed, wondering how you had ended up in a place where you couldn't trust even the people who were supposed to be there for you no matter what. You didn't sleep that night, your mind racing with everything you had seen and felt, the images from your mother's social media posts playing over and over again like a loop you couldn't turn off. And in the morning you forced yourself to eat a little of the food Ria had brought, to drink some water, to shower quickly in the hospital bathroom and try to put on a brave face for Arjun. But inside you were a storm of questions and doubts and emotions you couldn't quite name, and you made a decision, one you clung to like a lifeline in the chaos. You wouldn't confront your mother, not yet, not over text, not while you were still in shock and while Arjun was still recovering. You would wait, you would observe. You would document what you had seen, not for revenge but for clarity, reminding yourself of the hedge principle you had read about once, don't let emotions cloud the truth, and you told yourself you would get to the bottom of this, not through anger or accusation, but through patience and observation, and so you put your phone away, tucked the screenshots safely in a folder on your device, and focused on your son, on his slow recovery, on the small victories of each hour that passed without incident, and though the hurt and confusion lingered beneath the surface, you held them in check, determined to stay calm, to stay strong, and to uncover the truth in a way that wouldn't tear your family apart but might instead help you understand what had really happened. And as you sat by Arjun's bedside, watching him sleep, you whispered a silent promise to yourself that you would get to the bottom of this, not for revenge, but for truth, and for the strength to face whatever came next with clarity and grace. Nodding slowly, absorbing the information, telling yourself you needed to hear more, to understand more, before you made any judgments or decisions, and you thanked your uncle quietly, your mind already racing with questions you hadn't yet dared to ask, and as he left a short while later you sat back down beside Arjun, your thoughts a whirlwind of confusion, impatience, and the growing need for honesty. When your uncle arrived unexpectedly on the 6th day, stepping quietly into the hospital room with a bouquet of flowers and a look of concern etched deeply into his features, you were momentarily startled but grateful for the company, for the presence of someone who had always been steady and kind, and as he walked over to Arjun's bedside and looked down at your son with a soft smile, you thanked him for coming and offered him the extra chair beside you, and after a few minutes of quiet conversation about Arjun's progress and the doctor's updates, your uncle hesitated, glancing at you with a mix of sympathy and something else, hesitation, maybe regret, before he finally spoke. His voice low so as not to wake Arjun who was resting peacefully with his eyes closed, and he said, "I know your mom said she can't come. But, she's been asking me about Arjun every day. She's not broke," and your heart skipped a beat as those words sank in, the floor seeming to tilt slightly beneath you as you stared at your uncle in disbelief, your mind racing to reconcile what you had just heard with the text you had received and the excuse that had cut so deeply, and you felt a flood of emotions, anger, confusion, hurt, threatening to spill out, but you forced yourself to stay calm, to breathe, to listen, and your uncle continued, explaining that your mom had been calling in regularly, asking for updates, her voice tight with worry but also with something else, something she hadn't been able to put into words, and you sat there in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift and fall into place. And though part of you still ached with the sting of her excuse, another part of you began to wonder if there was more to her absence than you had initially assumed, and you realized that the story was more complicated than you had allowed yourself to believe, and though the hurt didn't disappear, you found yourself. Later that evening, after your uncle had gone and the hospital hallway had grown quiet once again, you found yourself sitting alone with your thoughts, Arjun sleeping peacefully beside you, his breathing slow and steady under the soft hum of the machines monitoring his vitals, and you couldn't stop thinking about what your uncle had told you, about your mom not being broke, about her asking for updates every day, and though part of you wanted to dismiss it as an excuse, another part of you, the part that had been quietly observing, documenting, and resisting the urge to react impulsively, began to consider the possibility that there was more to her absence than financial hardship. And you thought back to the stories she had shared about her own childhood, about how hospitals had always made her feel helpless and afraid after losing your father there, and you realized with a jolt that maybe her excuse hadn't been about money at all, but about fear, about not knowing how to face the pain and vulnerability of seeing her grandchild in a hospital bed, and though the excuse she had given had hurt you deeply and made you question her love and loyalty, you began to see a different possibility, one that didn't excuse the lie but offered a glimpse into the fear and pain that might have driven it, and you sat there in the quiet of the hospital room, your heart heavy but no longer solely filled with anger, and you made a silent promise to yourself that you would give her a chance to explain, but only when the time was right, when you were ready to hear her truth without letting your emotions cloud your judgment. And you looked down at Arjun's peaceful face and felt a surge of gratitude for the clarity that had begun to emerge from the chaos, and though the hurt hadn't disappeared, you realized you were beginning to understand that sometimes people's actions are driven by fear rather than malice, and that the path to healing required not just truth, but also empathy and patience. The next morning brought a small improvement in Arjun's condition, his fever had finally broken, his color was returning, and though he was still weak, the doctors were cautiously optimistic, and you felt a wave of relief wash over you, a fragile hope that things might finally be turning around, and as you sat beside him, holding his small hand in yours and watching him sleep, you felt a shift within yourself, a quiet strength beginning to emerge from the exhaustion and fear that had gripped you for days, and later that day when your mother finally called, her voice hesitant and unsure on the other end of the line, you answered with a calmness you hadn't felt in what felt like forever, and she stumbled through an apology, her words tumbling out in a rush as she explained that she had been scared, that hospitals reminded her too much of losing your father, that she hadn't known how to face it, and she admitted that the money excuse had been just that, an excuse, and that she had been too ashamed to admit the truth, and you listened without interrupting, your heart aching but no longer consumed by anger, and when she finished you took a deep breath and told her that you understood fear, but that you also deserved honesty, that next time she could simply say she was scared instead of hiding behind a lie, and though you didn't offer forgiveness right away, you left the door open, choosing to focus on healing rather than punishment, and as you ended the call you felt a sense of quiet resolution, knowing that the truth had finally come to light, and though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, you were beginning to see a path forward, one built on honesty, boundaries, and the kind of strength that comes not from anger, but from understanding and grace. Arjun was finally discharged a week later, his energy slowly returning as he smiled weakly from the back seat of the car on the drive home, his small hand clutching a stuffed animal the nurses had given him, and you felt a flood of relief and gratitude as you pulled into your driveway and carried him inside, his laughter echoing softly through the house as he settled into his own bed for the first time in what felt like forever, and though you were exhausted you couldn't stop smiling, your heart full as you watched him sleep peacefully that night, and in the days that followed you settled back into a quieter routine, cherishing the small moments of normalcy and watching your son regain his strength. And though the memory of the hospital and the pain and fear you had experienced there still lingered, you found yourself focusing more on the lessons you had learned, on the strength you had discovered within yourself, and on the importance of honesty and communication, and you thought about your mom, about the conversation you had, and about the complicated mix of emotions that still lingered, but you also felt a sense of clarity and resolve, knowing that you had chosen a path of understanding rather than revenge. And as you sat on the porch one evening watching the sunset with Arjun playing quietly nearby, you realized that you had come through something incredibly difficult, not just stronger, but wiser, and though the scars of the experience would remain, you knew you would carry them not as burdens, but as reminders of the power of truth, the importance of boundaries, and the resilience of the human heart. A few weeks after Arjun's return home, your mom called again, this time sounding more at ease, her voice warmer, more genuine, and though you had been hesitant to answer at first, you found yourself picking up the phone and listening as she apologized once more, this time with more depth and sincerity, and she told you she had been seeing a counselor to work through her anxiety around hospitals and loss, and that she was making an effort to face her fears rather than hide from them, and you listened quietly, your heart softening bit by bit as you heard the vulnerability in her voice, and though you didn't dare rush to forgive her completely, you told her that you appreciated her honesty and that you were willing to rebuild trust slowly. And when she asked if she could visit Arjun soon, you agreed, setting a date and feeling a sense of cautious optimism as you hung up the phone, and in the days leading up to her visit you found yourself reflecting on everything that had happened, on the pain and the misunderstandings, and on the journey you had taken to get to this point, and though the hurt hadn't completely disappeared, you realized you were no longer defined by it, and when your mom finally arrived, carrying a small gift for Arjun and a hesitant smile, you greeted her with a calmness that surprised even yourself, and as she sat on the floor playing with your son and laughing with him, you felt a sense of peace settle over you, knowing that healing wasn't about forgetting, but about choosing to move forward with honesty, compassion, and the strength that comes from understanding. Over the next few months, your relationship with your mom began to slowly rebuild, not overnight, but steadily, through small moments of connection and honesty. And though there were still moments of awkwardness and old wounds that occasionally resurfaced, you found yourself approaching those moments with more patience and understanding, and you made a conscious effort to set boundaries while also leaving room for growth and reconciliation, and as Arjun grew stronger and more energetic, running through the house and laughing with his grandmother, you felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey you had all been on, and though the scars of the hospital stay and the initial hurt would always be a part of your story, you also knew they had taught you something valuable about trust, communication, and the complexity of family relationships, and you thought about the hedge principles you had instinctively followed, seeking truth, protecting your emotional well-being, and choosing understanding over impulse, and you felt a sense of pride in the way you had handled a painful situation with grace and integrity, and as you sat on the porch one evening watching Arjun and your mom laugh together, you realized that sometimes the hardest moments in life lead to the deepest growth, and that even when trust is broken, it can be rebuilt, slowly and carefully, with honesty, paciencia, and love. Looking back on everything that had happened, you often found yourself reflecting on the lessons you had learned, not just about your mom, but about yourself, about the importance of boundaries, the power of truth, and the strength it takes to stay calm in the face of hurt and betrayal, and though there were still moments when you felt the sting of the initial disappointment, you had learned to acknowledge those feelings without letting them consume you, and you had discovered a quiet inner resilience that you hadn't known you possessed, and as you watched your son grow and thrive, surrounded by family, even if that family was complicated and imperfect, you felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey, for the pain that had led to growth, and for the people who had shown up in the ways that mattered, and you knew that you would carry the lessons of that time with you always, not as burdens, but as reminders of the importance of honesty, the value of empathy, and the strength that comes from choosing understanding over anger, and though the road had been difficult, you also knew that it had made you stronger, wiser, and more compassionate, and as you sat quietly one evening reflecting on everything, you felt a sense of peace settle over you, knowing that you had faced one of the hardest moments of your life with grace, integrity, and courage. In the end, the truth had set you free, not in the dramatic, instantaneous way you might have imagined, but in the slow, steady unfolding of understanding, forgiveness, and healing. And though your mom's initial excuse had hurt you deeply and made you question her love and loyalty, you had chosen to seek the truth with patience and clarity rather than reacting in anger or despair. And through that journey you had discovered a deeper understanding of fear, of vulnerability, and of the Complexities of family relationships, and as you looked at your son playing happily with his grandmother, their laughter filling the room with warmth and light, you felt a profound sense of gratitude for the lessons you had learned and the strength you had found within yourself, and though the scars of the experience would always be a part of your story, they no longer defined you, and you knew that you had emerged from the pain not broken, but stronger, wiser, and more compassionate, and as you sat quietly in the fading light of the evening, you whispered a silent thank you to the version of yourself that had chosen truth over assumption, patience over impulse, and love over anger, and you knew that the hardest moments in life often held the greatest lessons, and that sometimes, the truth, however painful it may be at first, is the key to healing, growth, and lasting peace. Sometimes, the real victory is not letting yourself lose, even if the other person wins with a lie. If you've ever felt something like this, please let me know in the comments. I read every comment. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. Don't forget to share it with someone close to you, they might need to hear it too. And if you want to hear more such real stories, subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story.